Hello, everyone. Welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. I'm your host, stand-up comedian, author, and PsyCon MC, Leanne Lord. And I hope you are indeed planning to join us June 11th through 14th for PsyCon's 50th anniversary. It's going to be amazing. Like, I just booked my flight, and I'm saying maybe you should too. Now, as you can see, Skeptical Inquirer Presents is now streaming on several social media platforms, including Facebook and YouTube. And so no matter where you're joining us from, you can pop your questions about the presentation into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Tonight, we are learning about the challenge of popularizing science with Skeptical Inquirer Presents alum Joe Schwarcz. My friends, storytelling is a powerful thing. Star Wars, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Slick Rick, once upon a time not long ago when people wore pajamas and lived life slow. And so storytelling is a great way to interest people in science. And few people know and do that like Joe Schwarcz. There are fascinating stories like where Sherlock Holmes was interested in jellyfish. Why was that? Why phrenology is a pseudoscience? Why King George III was plagued with purple urine? Was it because he was a Prince fan? I think not. But side note, purple urine, ew. Dr. Joe can explain the links between Harry Potter and the mandrake root, between Bicycle Day and the use of LSD. Like, how do we even get there? Inquiring minds want to know. And so tonight, Dr. Joe will discuss the challenges of popularizing science and explain why people are intrigued by accounts of how negative ions have positive effects, how memory supplements work, whether performance enhancing supplements really enhance performance. Place your bets now, and may the odds be ever in your favor. Now, Joe Schwarcz, if y'all don't know, is a renowned science communicator and storyteller. He's the director of McGill University's Office for Science and Society, which has the mission of separating sense from nonsense. Those are very different things. He's the recipient of numerous awards for teaching chemistry and for interpreting science for the public. He was the first person outside of the United States to win the American Chemical Society's prestigious Grady Stack Award for popularizing chemistry. Dr. Joe has hosted a radio show on science for 45 years. He's a regular newspaper column. He has a regular newspaper column, and he's the author of 20 best-selling books. His latest, I actually have it right here. I'm so glad CFI sends me these. Better Not Burn Your Toast, The Science of Food and Health, which I hope he talks about tonight. So please welcome back to Skeptical Inquirer Presents science storyteller extraordinaire, Joe Schwarcz. Sir.
Well, thanks very much. And as you mentioned, I do direct McGill's Office for Science and Society, where we try to separate sense from nonsense. Question is, how exactly do you go about doing that? You know, if you think back to the movie Cool Hand Luke, the line that I remember most was, "What we got here is a failure to communicate." Of course, many other people will remember Paul Newman eating 50 hard-boiled eggs, but to me, this was the most striking one, because it hits right at the heart of science. We got to communicate. If you don't communicate, then what is the point of doing it? Anne Rowe, who was a noted clinical psychologist, is the one who really came up with the idea that nothing happens in science if you really can't communicate it. But the question is, how do we go about it? How do we get the message out? And what I'm going to propose today is that one way to do that is by storytelling. Now, I can't tell you every story that was mentioned in the introduction, of course, so I have to pick and choose. But of course, inherent in this whole idea of storytelling is that you've got to have the facts right. And I've been a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, ever since I started to read, and especially of this famous quote that you really have to have the facts before you have theories, not the other way around. So storytelling and keeping to the facts is really what it's all about. So why don't we start with a Sherlock Holmes story? And you'll know that Sherlock Holmes is associated with the deerstalker hat, which actually was never mentioned in any of the stories. This was just an illustration that Sidney Paget made in some of the early stories published in the Strand magazine. But it's incredible how this took off, and people will immediately associate it with Holmes. Well, the short story that I do want to bring to your attention is The Adventure of the Lion's Mane. Interesting illustration on this cover, because the story actually has nothing to do with lions. It has to do with jellyfish, type of jellyfish that is called the lion's mane. Sherlock and a policeman discover a body, and it looks as if he had somehow been lashed with some sort of leather strips. Well, it turns out that it is a jellyfish, and Sherlock Holmes at that point comments that it is as dangerous as being bitten by a cobra. Unfortunately, this is one of the first few times that Holmes was actually incorrect, because the jellyfish in question, which is known as the lion's mane, is not all that dangerous. It's not pleasant to be stung. You get these welts, but it is not a life-threatening situation. However, there certainly are jellyfish that are extremely dangerous, such as this one, which is known as a sea wasp. And boy, that's a good term for it, because you sure feel that sting. And indeed, it can kill in just a couple of minutes because of the protein poison or venom that it injects. And you had better get your hands on some vinegar very quickly if you get stung, because that will remove these tiny little darts that are injected by the jellyfish into the skin. There's a myth also that what you should do is urinate on a wound. This is totally wrong. You should not do that. It actually activates those little darts. Now, there's another type of lion's mane that connects to this story. And, this is the kind of thing that I like to do, is to start with one story and see where it can lead. Well, where can this one lead? To the mushroom that is known as the lion's mane, which is very pretty mushroom, as you can see, very, very interesting. And it has a long history. Ancient China, it was thought that somehow eating this mushroom would open up these so-called non-existent qi channels in the body, which transmit the non-existent life force. In any case, it has a long history. But just because it has a long history doesn't mean that it has a long, valid history in terms of science. Today, lion's mane supplements are sold in health food stores with all kinds of claims about what these can do. They fight inflammation, they fight cancer, they protect the gut, etc., support heart health. Most of that is not evidence-based. Now, there are some interesting studies that have been done with this, and the lion's mane actually may have some very small effect on improving cognition. But if you really read the papers, you see that that effect is really not highly significant, even though it may be statistically significant. There's a big difference between statistical significance and practical significance. So at this point, I don't think that there's any reason to start taking lion's mane. Not to say that fungi are useless in terms of health. I mean, one of the classic cases, of course, is Alexander Fleming's discovery of Penicillium notatum, which was a fungus. And, as the story goes, he was away for the weekend. He was culturing some bacteria in a petri dish, and the mold flew in through the window. And when he came back Monday morning, he looked at the petri dish, and he saw that around the mold, the bacteria had died. Most of the people would have just said, gee, I better start this experiment again. But he recognized that the mold was actually releasing something that kills bacteria. He was never able to isolate it. It took another 10 years before Chain and Florey were able to commercialize penicillin. And the three were eventually awarded the Nobel Prize in 1945 for this discovery, one of the most important discoveries in the history of medicine. So fungi can cure, but fungi can also kill. Amanita phalloides, as you can see, has a very complex toxin in it. It can literally kill in a few minutes. And this has happened. In fact, quite recently in Australia, there was murder that was committed with these poisonous mushrooms. The lady put it in the food of some relatives. But it is interesting that the mushroom that is illustrated here, and which was illustrated in many of the accounts of this, is actually Amanita muscaria. It is not a poisonous mushroom to the extent that phalloides is, but somehow the story was always illustrated with this. It's a terrible story because the lady killed a number of family members by putting the mushroom into their food. Eventually, she was convicted, and she is in jail. But talking about spreading misinformation, all the accounts of this are illustrated with the Amanita muscaria. Amanita muscaria, which is not all that toxic, is interesting. It does have a hallucinogenic effect. And that's noteworthy because it crops up so often in illustrations of Alice in Wonderland. And the idea is, although it really is not well documented, that Lewis Carroll was trying to illustrate hallucinogenic mushrooms, and he may even have taken them himself. But I think that is a little far-fetched. Of course, there are mushrooms that are psychedelic, and magic mushroom, the one that you're looking at here, is one of these. It is indeed one that can cause hallucinations, and this is what is referred to as psychedelic effect. It's a term that was coined way back in 1956 by Humphrey Osmond. And as soon as we start talking about psychedelics, I think our mind shifts to LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, and therein lies another fascinating story. There's a fungus that grows mostly on the rye plant. It's this black fungus that you see here, and it contains lysergic acid. Not lysergic diethylamide, but a very similar compound, lysergic acid. And this causes hallucinations. It is a fascinating story because this molecule is structurally similar to serotonin. And serotonin is a neurotransmitter that indeed is associated with thought processes or mood, and it can cause hallucinations. And there are some interesting historical accounts here. One of them is St. Anthony's fire. St. Anthony's fire is a disease, and it was relatively rampant in the Middle Ages when people would consume rye that had been tainted with this fungus. And of course, they didn't know that they should not be consuming this. And they had seizures and hallucinations, muscle spasms, burning sensations. This is why it's called St. Anthony's fire, because of the burning sensations. And in those days, people would rely on religion to be cured, and they would go to the Order of St. Anthony, which was a Christian order, because the monks here had a history of being able to cure various diseases. Well, they really couldn't cure St. Anthony's fire, except that when people went there and would stay there, they would no longer be eating contaminated rye, so they could get better. Saint Anthony was a very interesting saint, and it's quite common to pray to him to be healed. And what you see there in the box is one of his ribs, supposedly, and people would worship that relic, hoping for cures. However, perhaps the most interesting connection of the ergot fungus is to the Salem witch trials, which occurred in 1692, when, on the word of some young girls, a number of people in the town of Salem, Massachusetts, were basically said to be witches. And the story is that the young girls probably had hallucinations because they had consumed rye, which was the staple grain at that time. The summer was very wet, and that was very conducive to the growth of the ergot fungus. And because the little girls' low body weight, they were more affected than the adults. And believe it or not, 20 women were hanged based upon their words, essentially generated by lysergic acid, which gave them the hallucinations. It's a very interesting story. It has been written up in scientific papers. It is somewhat controversial because, of course, it's after the fact. You can never prove it. But I like the story because it gets you into LSD, as we will, and you can have some very interesting stories to talk about that. For example, way back in around 1800, Dr. John Stearns discovered that an extract of this ergot fungus could induce labor, and that was something that previously had never been done. So this was a big step forward in medicine. And it also turned out that the same extract of the fungus could control heavy bleeding after giving childbirth. So here was a natural product that actually became a very interesting medicine. But the most captivating story here is about Albert Hofmann, who in 1938 in Switzerland was studying the ergot fungus. And he looked at the structure of the molecule, and he started to fiddle around with it to see whether or not he could make any derivatives which were somehow medically useful. This is a very common thing that is done in pharmaceutical chemistry. You have a substance that has some effect, but it isn't exactly the best effect. So you try to massage the molecule to see if you can come up with something better. So he came up with methergine, which was very effective in labor and in controlling bleeding. And then in 1938, he tried to synthesize some other derivatives of lysergic acid, and he synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide, but he really didn't do anything with it at that time. He didn't see that it has any kind of an effect. So he left it for a few years. And then for some reason in 1943, he came back to it. He synthesized some more LSD, and he actually tasted it. Well, in those days, researchers did things like that. They became their own guinea pigs. He really tasted it. And he all of a sudden started to see bright colors, hallucinations. And this obviously intrigued him. So he wanted to see whether or not this was reproducible. And on April 19, 1943, he took a dose on purpose of LSD. And this is really the birth of essentially psychedelic medicine, which today is being looked at very seriously as having some potential treatments for mental illness. But here is his original description. As you can see, at 4:20, he ingested it, and then pretty soon, slight dizziness, unrest, difficulty in concentration, visual disturbances, etc. And then he decided that he had better go home at that point. He wasn't feeling great. And he got on his bicycle That was the mode of transportation at that time. And on his bicycle trip home, he had another kind of trip, which was an LSD trip. And as you can see, the way that he described this, like he was looking through a kaleidoscope of colors. And this day is celebrated up to the current date as Bicycle Day, April 19th, which was the first LSD experience. LSD, as I said, is very similar to serotonin, which is the reason that it has this psychedelic effect. And there were a lot of people who became very interested in LSD, including Timothy Leary, who was a psychology professor at Harvard, and who implored his students to experiment with the mind-expanding effects of LSD. For this, President Nixon called him the most dangerous man in America. He was fired from Harvard at that time, but he had certainly intrigued not only the students, but the hippie generation. And at Woodstock, for example, it was very common for people to take acid trips. They would take a very small amount of LSD and enjoy the music a lot more. And supposedly, the Beatles also liked this effect. And Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, as the story goes, is really an ode to LSD. And there's the L, there's the S, and the D. We will never know whether that is really true or not, but anyway, it makes for an interesting story, and it allows you to talk about the chemistry of LSD, which is important to talk about because today researchers are indeed focusing on using these kind of drugs as psychedelics. And there are some very interesting results with this. Hoffman eventually wrote a book on LSD. My Problem Child is what he called it. It's really quite a fascinating read. And he also worked on psilocybin, which is the chemical that is present in the magic mushroom, in the psilocybe mushroom. And he recognized that it had a molecular structure that was similar to LSD. And here is his personal note on that. As you can see, his hand-drawn structure of LSD and of psilocybin, where you can see the similarities. And as you can see, this sold at auction for $899. So I would have actually thought that it would go for more than that, because it is really a fascinating historical document. So far we've been talking about the ergo fungus, but we can transfer from that to a tree, which is the cinchona tree. The cinchona tree grows mostly in Peru. And what a fascinating history it has, and the intriguing stories that you can connect to it. Well, perhaps the most famous one is malaria. Malaria, of course, is a disease, terrible disease, which is transmitted by the female mosquito when it feeds on blood so that it can nurture its offspring. It is only the female that stings and can transmit the disease, but it spreads this protozoan parasite, and malaria is associated with very high fever, and historically it has been a catastrophic disease, and in fact it still is today. We don't worry about it here in North America, we don't see it, but certainly in the developing world, in Africa, malaria is still a scourge, and it still appears in South America as well. Well, the story of the cinchona tree takes us to Peru, and the bark of the tree, which was called obviously Peruvian bark, turned out to be potentially curative for malaria. Exactly how that was discovered, nobody really knows. Many of these discoveries of natural products were really trial and error over centuries. because what resource did people have up to, about 100, 150 years ago? If they were sick, they would try eating something or drinking something. And where would they get it? They would get it from nature. And of course, sometimes these things would be poisonous and those would be forgotten. And in rare cases, they turned out to be useful. Peruvian bark turned out to be useful. It was imported into Europe from Peru by the Jesuits, and it was called Jesuit bark. And it was very much sought after because in Europe, malaria was actually quite rampant. And the Jesuits were very fair about who they would give this bark to. If you were poor, you would get it for free. If you were rich, you had to pay for it in an equivalent weight of gold, equivalent to the amount that it took to cure you. So the Jesuits really were very fair about this. But in England, there was an issue with the Jesuit bark because Oliver Cromwell was the ruler, and he would have none of this because, of course, he was staunchly anti-Catholic. He was a Protestant. And even though he came down with malaria, he refused to take the Jesuit bark, saying that he would rather go to a Protestant heaven than live in a Catholic hell on earth. Well, we don't know exactly which way he went, but we know that he did not take the Jesuit bark. Well, today, of course, we know that the active ingredient in the bark is chemical called quinine, which they did not know at that time. And in fact, the science of quinine only began to be unraveled much later, in the 1800s, by August Wilhelm Hofmann, a noted German chemist, a pupil of Liebig, who was probably the best-known chemist at that time. And Hofmann was invited to England by Prince Albert. Prince Albert was Queen Victoria's husband, and he was a champion of science. He wanted Britain to be the world's leader in science. Interesting enough, he was German, but he had married the English queen. And Germany at that time was really the leading light in science. So he invited Hofmann to come to England to set up what would be called the first institute that really focused on chemistry. The Royal College of Chemistry. And only the most elite students were invited to study here. It's really was a historic place. Unfortunately, the building itself no longer exists. This is what is in its place. But there actually is a plaque there. You can see the green arrow points to it. And the plaque recognizes that this was the former site of the Royal College of Chemistry. And it really holds a place as a landmark in the history of chemistry. And therein lies a really interesting story. And that story takes us to young William Henry Perkin. William Henry Perkin was actually too young to enroll in this college, but he had become enamored of chemistry just reading on his own. And he was familiar with Michael Faraday and with Humphrey Davy, John Dalton, who were the noted English scientists at the time. And he just fell in love with chemistry. This is what he wanted to do. So one day he knocked on the door of the Royal College. And he eventually got to speak to Hofmann. And Hofmann said, well, you have to wait a few years until you're old enough. And he said, no, I will do anything. If you want, I will just help the students here. I will clean the glassware. I will do anything that you want. And I think he was so persistent that Hofmann said, all right, let's give this a try. And he became part of the team. And here's a fascinating picture. There's Hofmann in the middle, in the front row, and there's young Perkin, who became extremely adept, not only at washing glassware, he became very adept at doing chemical reactions. And Hoffman himself had been working on quinine, and he had discovered the elemental composition of quinine. Now, in those days, they really didn't know very much at all. Well, they knew nothing about molecular structure. They didn't know anything about, how atoms were joined together. I mean, John Dalton had some early ideas about atoms being balls and, how they could be linked together. But it was rather unsophisticated science at that time. But what they were able to do was to do elemental analysis. They could discover the ratio of carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens in a sample through a technique that had been developed by Liebig. You burn the sample, the carbon gets converted to carbon dioxide, the hydrogen gets converted to water, and you can back calculate and figure out what the formula must be. So Hoffman knew this. And when the Easter holidays rolled around in 1856, young Perkin said that he didn't want to just go home and relax because the college was going to be shut down for 2 weeks. And he said, I don't want to be without chemistry for 2 weeks. And I'm sure you can all appreciate that. Who on earth would want to be without chemistry for 2 weeks? And he kept begging Hoffman to give him some advice on what he could do at home, what kind of experiments he could do. Well, Hoffman already, as I said, had done some work on quinine, and he had calculated the composition in terms of elements. And he also knew that a chemical extracted from coal tar, the tar left behind when coal burns, contained aniline. And aniline had carbon in it, hydrogen, and nitrogen in a ratio very similar to what he had found for quinine. So he wondered, he didn't have any oxygen, so he wondered whether or not you could treat this with some chemical that adds oxygen, which is what we call an oxidizing agent, to make quinine. So because young Perkin was so persistent, and I suspect annoying, he said, all right, why don't you go home? Why don't you take some aniline, which is extracted from coal tar, and add some oxidizing agents to it and see if you can make quinine. Now, of course, in hindsight, we know that this was a totally impossible quest because the molecular structures are dramatically different. There was no way that you were going to get quinine out of aniline. But he kept doing his experiments. He would take the aniline, add potassium chlorate, potassium permanganate, the classic oxidizing agents, and he would get various kinds of gums. And they were very difficult to clean out of the glassware. And usually when you use soap and water, you can get things out, but he would come up with these gums that were almost impossible to clean. And one day, he really couldn't clean his glassware with water. So he decided that he was going to try another solvent. So he had this gummy residue from his reaction of trying to oxidize aniline, and he poured in the alcohol, and all of a sudden, the sink turned into a brilliant color, a color that he had never seen before. Yes, it was a purplish color, and purple color did exist, but not this particular shade. Eventually, this color came to be called mauve, and it became extremely popular. Now, there's a little corollary to this story, which makes it even more interesting. Had he started with pure aniline, it would not have happened, because it turns out that the aniline that he started with was contaminated with a compound called allyl-toluidine. And that, when reacted with an oxidizing agent, is what gave rise to this first synthetic dye, because that's what this was. Now, there had been natural dyes before. For example, a certain kind of mollusk found mostly in Lebanon at that time gave rise to a purple color. It was called Tyrian purple. Roman togas were dyed with that. But this was a different kind of purple. It was a color that no one had ever seen before. There were other natural dyes. The madder root gives you red. Indigo, of course, will give you blue. But here was a totally new shade. And here is a piece of the original fabric that he dyed with that dye that he made in 1956. Now, once again, someone else may have done exactly the same thing and noticed that the sink turned into this brilliant purple color and would have just said, hell, how do I clean this sink? But Perkin recognized the fact that he had made a discovery. He was able to capitalize on it. Luckily, his father had some money, so he borrowed some money from his father, and he built a factory to start commercial production of fabrics colored with this beautiful dye. And the decade after the discovery is known today as the mauve decade. Ladies started to wear mauve dresses, and when Queen Victoria herself started to wear the color, all of a sudden everyone wanted this. In fact, for a decade after the discovery, the so-called penny royals, the British stamps, were colored with mauve. It became the thing. When you stop in the street corner, policemen would come up to you and tell you to move on. I know you think that is kind of silly, but you'll be telling it to your friends. Anyway, Perkin became sort of the elder statesman of chemistry. He retired officially when he was still in his 30s, but he still kept doing research privately and even came up with a reaction called the Perkin reaction, which we still teach in organic chemistry. And here is his famous portrait, which hangs in the Portrait Gallery in London, where he is shown holding a piece of silk that is colored with mauve. In 1906, he was invited to come to the US to be the first recipient of the Perkin Medal. And this was, of course, to honor him, but also it was established to honor subsequent scientists on an annual basis who made some great contribution to industrial chemistry. And that is a tradition that has been kept going. Now, the first Perkin dinner was held in New York at Delmonico's, a restaurant, and many Perkin dinners have been held at that restaurant since then. And this is when the medal is actually presented to the recipient of that year. It is an event to which only the top-notch scientists are invited. And if you are invited, you get a letter in the mail, an invitation, and it's sort of a thick envelope, because in the envelope is a purple or a mauve bow tie, which is actually dyed with his original mauve. In 1906, when he came to the US, he brought with him a sample of the original mauve that he had made in 1956, and he gifted this to Columbia University. And it is still there. And every year they take out just a touch of that, because that's all you need to color the silk. And they color the bow ties. And these days, women are invited too, and they get a silk scarf that is colored with mauve. Well, once Perkin had discovered, accidentally, but capitalized on it, that you could make this synthetic dye, then of course the race was on to make other synthetic colors as well. And very quickly, there were all kinds. The raw material was petroleum, From petroleum, you can extract aniline, you can extract very similar compounds. And all of a sudden, the world took on all kinds of brilliant new shades. And then, of course, it occurred to scientists that if you could synthesize different dyes, you could synthesize other chemicals as well. So companies that at first specialized in producing dyes, such as the Friedrich Bayer Company, started to carry out research to see what else was possible through chemical synthesis. And pretty soon, they found that you could make medications. The first one, 1897, was aspirin, which is still probably the most widely used medication in the world today. And the raw material that you see there, salicylic acid, is extracted, or at least is produced from a chemical called phenol, which is found in coal tar, reacted with acetic anhydride, and you get aspirin. And that is still the way that it is made. But then, of course, chemical synthesis really took off. When chemists saw that you could make dyes and you could make simple drugs, what else could you make? And believe it or not, by 1944, Robert Woodward, who is the most famous and probably the best synthetic organic chemist who has ever lived, was able to synthesize quinine. And here is the first report of that in a published journal. Woodward was an amazing guy. And this picture is very representative because he's got alcohol in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He was a borderline alcoholic and he was a chain smoker, but he was absolutely brilliant. Those of you who know some chemistry will appreciate the tremendously elaborate process of synthesizing quinine. Here is just a little example of some of the reactions that are involved. So from that discovery in 1856 of mauve, chemists realized that you could make all kinds of things. Now, of course, to make quinine is not a commercially attractive enterprise because quinine, which is still used today, is so readily extracted from the bark of the cinchona tree. However, the fact that it could be synthesized was landmark because the chemical reactions that were needed, that were developed to make quinine, could be used in all kinds of other syntheses. So, it's fascinating that from one little accident in 1856, we get chemical synthesis. But there's yet another connection to quinine, and that is homeopathy, which is one of the most misunderstood medical endeavors, putting medical in quotes. Homeopathy is a pseudoscience that goes back to Samuel Hahnemann in the late 1700s. And in those days, quinine was, of course, already being used to treat malaria. But they didn't have standardized amounts. I mean, they just made crude extracts from cinchona bark. And Hahnemann was interested in knowing what was the maximum amount that you could give to a patient without causing harm, which was a legitimate thought process. And he became his own guinea pig. He started to take increasing amounts of this crude quinine solution to see what would happen. And he wanted to know how much could be tolerated by his patients without causing any harm. Obviously not something we would do today, but in those days that was commonly done. And he found that when he got to a certain amount, he developed a fever, just like he saw in his patients who had malaria. But he had been giving them much smaller doses. And this is when homeopathy was born. The idea that a healthy person, given a substance that causes symptoms, will cure those symptoms in a sick person when it is diluted. Of course, it's a scientifically nonsensical argument, but Hahnemann believed in it. And then he started to try other substances to see what symptoms they would cause. He experimented with things like arsenic on his relatives and friends. Wasn't a good idea to be a Hahnemann relative in those days. So, for example, he would do these provings. He would take arsenic trioxide, give it higher doses to a subject, and then they got gastric pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and therefore this was a treatment for food poisoning, because those are the symptoms that you would get with food poisoning. But he knew that he had always given his patients much smaller doses than what caused these side effects. So thus was born the second tenet of homeopathy, that if you dilute things, they become more potent. Again, logical in nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever, but somehow made sense to Hahnemann. The fact is, we know today that after 1200-fold dilutions of a solution, you don't have any of the original molecules left. So when you are getting a homeopathic remedy, all you're getting is the solvent, which is usually water. How do we explain that people are happy sometimes with using homeopathic therapy? And of course, the classic explanation here is the placebo effect, which is a potent effect. 30-40% of the time, the mind will take over the physiology of the body, and you can have a beneficial result. Of course, it is not going to cure cancer, it's not going to cure heart disease, but it can take away pain. So these are, I think, some interesting stories, and I hope I've demonstrated to you how storytelling can work to get across how interesting science is, and also how complicated it is, and how sometimes accidental discoveries can lead to significant improvements. This is what I've tried to do in my books, including in the latest one, which is Better Not Burn Your Toast. And of course, therein lies another interesting story. Why don't you want to burn your toast? Because when you do that, you form a compound called acrylamide. And acrylamide is nasty. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has put it in group 2A, probable carcinogen. It's not a certain carcinogen, but nevertheless, you don't like the idea of probably causing cancer. But it's also important to understand that the IR classification is a hazard analysis, not a risk analysis. It does not take into account extent of exposure. The only thing it takes into account whether or not it is possible that a substance can cause disease. Classic example, would be a shark in the water. If you're standing on the beach and you're watching a shark, there's no problem for you, but the hazard of the shark is still there. It has the capability of biting you. If you're in the water, it's a completely different story, because then the risk becomes real. So this is a hazard analysis. But nevertheless, we want to be careful, because any time that you have a sugar like glucose, an amino acid like asparagine, the two can react and produce acrylamide. The amounts are tiny, but that's enough for IARC to classify it as a carcinogen. In fact, any time that you bake bread, you will also get some acrylamide, because you have some glucose and you have some asparagine in the bread. But to put this into perspective and forget the hazard, how much of a risk is this? Well, it turns out that in order to get an amount of acrylamide that could be a problem, you'd have to eat 6,000 loaves of bread. That is a lot of loaves of bread. I like bread. I like sourdough bread, but I don't think I would go for 6,000 loaves in one day. Well, this leaves us at a point where I think it is appropriate to ask if there are any burning questions out there, because indeed, when we burn anything that contains glucose and asparagine, you get some acrylamide and you get a concern. So if there are questions out there about what I've talked about here, or indeed anything else, or you have some comments about science communication, storytelling, I'd certainly be happy to hear. Just one reminder: we do have a website, and that's this. And if you go there, you can just with one click sign up for a weekly newsletter, which comes to you every Saturday morning. And it's got a barrage of interesting stories, I think, which are entertaining and informative. And if any of you want to address any specific question to me or comments, that's my email. So I think at this point we can open it up to see if there are any questions or comments. Thanks very much for listening, and hope you can remember some of these stories or bits of it, and entice your students and friends to start looking into science from that point of view.
Joe, thank you. Thank you so much. I wrote so many notes because the biggest takeaway for me around storytelling about science, or I guess storytelling in general, you gave background, you gave context, you gave nuance. So it's not just the facts, but you couch them in a very historical and entertaining way. But you also reminded us that a long history of something is not the same as a long true history of something. So thank you for that reminder. I always love the penicillin story because it's a reminder to take the weekend off. You never know what happens while you're gone. Don't stay at your microscope all day. I love that the psychedelic treatments are being more seriously studied now, but my insurance doesn't cover them. Unfortunately, I had never heard the story before of the Jesuit bark and how the Jesuits made it free for poor people, but rich people had to pay. I mean, today I think everybody would have to subscribe because everything's a subscription model now. And as you can see, because I so enjoyed the history of mauve, I had no idea. I went and changed my shirt to the most mauve thing I could find in my closet.
Well, I tell you another little story about mauve, but you have to promise not to tell anyone.
Sure.
That that bottle of mauve that I told you that was given to Columbia University, which is in a showcase at
Yeah.
Columbia University. I had a colleague at Columbia who had a key to that showcase. One evening,
No.
snuck in there, opened that showcase, and I stole a couple of milligrams of the original mauve, which I have in a tiny little bottle in my office, and a tiny little piece of the original silk fabric that Perkin had left at Columbia. So that probably is my most treasured memorabilia.
I
Uh,
I love that, but I'm going to say I'm going to just reframe the word stole and say that resources were reallocated to a different location.
Good way to put it.
I don't want the mauve police to hunt you down, sir. You are too valuable to the community. And speaking of community, we do have a couple of folks, and I always have to put on my glasses. Wish I had purple glasses for this, but because now I definitely want some, excuse me, some mauve glasses. And we do have mauve questions. How did Perkins make sure that he built his mauve empire on contaminated material? Like what?
Yeah, well, of course, nobody knows exactly how that happened, but one would think that next time that he tried the experiment, and he would have tried another batch of aniline, it would not have worked. And then he went backwards and figure out what could have been the difference. I mean, I don't think it was an overnight
No.
story. I mean, it may have taken a while to figure that out. But so much of science is trial and error. You find something works, and next time it doesn't work, you figure out why it didn't work, and you try another experiment. And it probably took until they were able to mass produce it. I mean, it took years.
Mhm.
But I mean, it's just a fascinating story because it's double accident, right? I mean,
Yes.
the first thing was the accident of rinsing his flask with alcohol, and the second accident was that it wouldn't have happened if it had not been a contaminated sample. But as Louis Pasteur famously said, chance favors the prepared mind. So
Mm,
there undoubtedly have been many accidents in history of science that were never recognized as leading to anything. But he recognized, that, I mean, just like Fleming, he looked at his contaminated petri dish, and he recognized that bacteria were dying around the periphery of the mold.
mhm.
Someone else may have made nothing of that.
Yeah. And again, I posit that it's good that he had the weekend off. He might have come in a little hungover, and instead of going right to cleaning that dish, went, "What
Yeah.
happened here?"
I've actually been in London to St. Mary's Hospital where this happened, and the room where it happened is preserved,
Okay.
and they show you the window through which the mold supposedly flew in. I don't, hard to document that, but the lab is maintained as it was in those days, so it's real, a historical landmark.
One less room to clean. Um, now I also want to know the answer to this one. Where did Perkins get the name mauve? How did that?
Yeah, I think it's some sort of derivative of a French name for purple. Mauvain is a French purple, in old fashioned French. Mauvain
Oh,
was purple.
Mauve. Oh, that's right. That's I
Yeah,
thought that was a typo, but that's actually how they did type it, Mauvain.
yeah.
I didn't realize. I haven't gotten up to the all the colors in my Duolingo studies of French. So,
Mm.
and I'm going to give a stab at this one. I guess this is an overall question for those of us who want to not be taken in. But what is the special personal quality about a person that arms or fortifies them to notice that a product or offer is a scam or suspect or not a value? I guess this is coming off of you talking about.
Boy, I mean that unfortunately is not a question that I can address in 1 minute. Because I spent 50 years trying to separate the nonsense from the sense, and
Yes.
it's very difficult.
Hmm.
Because I mean, there are some people, whose mind is just so shut to anything novel that you're never going to get anywhere. I mean, obviously, this is a very topical question now, especially in your country, because of what
Yes.
Kennedy is doing, which is I mean, to any scientist, is just unbelievable how he is dismantling the scientific method, how he's destroying the whole concept of vaccination. I mean, it is unbelievable that these days we would be discussing vaccination. It's as if we were discussing whether it's true that the earth goes around the sun, and yet that's what is happening. It's unbelievable. So I don't have a magical answer there about how to counter it,
Hmm.
except that you keep harping away on the best science, on what science has shown, how we
Hmm.
know what we know, what peer-reviewed research is, why we should believe that more than the people who are saying stupid things like carnivore diet is the solution to everything, or that ivermectin cures cancer. These are the kind of things which are zero evidence, and yet they are becoming popular, just because Kennedy repeats them often enough, and you repeat something often enough, especially to people who are not well versed in science, and it becomes true by repetition.
Yeah.
It is a very unfortunate situation, as an observer, to see what is happening there.
As someone living here, yes, I absolutely agree. And while this shorthand doesn't work for anything, I would venture to say that if it sounds too good to be true, It is.
That is, I think, almost always the case. If it sounds too good to be true, it is too good to be true. There are no miracles in science. There are small steps to go forward. Very rarely do we have huge leaps. We progress by a series of small steps.
Yes.
And sometimes, unfortunately, there are steps backwards that are taken.
Oh, indeed. But as I saw somewhere in the comments, there is always gin and tonic, everyone.
Yes, and the quinine is there in the tonic.
Lots of thank yous for you in the comments. You and you know how I feel. Thank you for what you do. Skeptical Inquirer Presents always is thankful that you're able to share your expertise with us. And I just want to say that if you have missed any of tonight's presentation, it has been recorded and will be more quickly available, of course, at skepticalinquirer.org, but you can access it relatively quickly on our YouTube channel. And again, I hope that you can join us June 11th through 14th for SciCon's 50th anniversary. And my thanks, as always, to Skeptical Inquirer, to CFI, and of course to all of you in the audience for choosing to spend your time with us. My name again is Leanne Lord. It's always my pleasure to be with you, and à la prochaine. Good night, everyone.